On the morning of April 1st, 1990, Arizona Highway Patrol Trooper Mike Miller was cruising along Interstate 10 when he spotted a semi-truck parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. Thinking the driver might need assistance, Miller pulled over and climbed onto the cab to investigate. What he saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his career. Between the seats in the rear of the cab was a nude woman, chained to the wall with handcuffs. In her mouth was a horse's bridle, the kind used to control animals. Her body was covered in fresh welts and cuts. Lying beside her, seemingly asleep, was the truck's driver. When the woman saw Miller, she began screaming for help through the bridle, her eyes wide with terror and desperation. The man in the cab was Robert Ben Rhodes, and what Miller had stumbled upon was a mobile torture chamber that had been rolling across America's highways for over 15 years. Inside that truck, behind a facade of ordinary trucking business, Rhodes had created a nightmare designed specifically for one purpose: the systematic torture and murder of women. But Rhodes wasn't born a monster. Like many of the most disturbing killers in American history, his story began with circumstances that might have shaped any child differently, or perhaps revealed something that was always lurking beneath the surface. Robert Ben Rhodes was born on November 22nd, 1945, in Council Bluffs, Iowa, into what appeared to be a normal American family. His father was a soldier in the United States Army, stationed in West Germany during Robert's early years. His mother raised him alone through his formative childhood while his father served overseas. By all accounts, these early years passed without incident. The first crack in Robert's foundation came when his father returned from military service and found work as a firefighter. Robert was just entering elementary school, and for the first time in his life, he had a male authority figure in his home. But the man who returned from war was different somehow, carrying invisible wounds that would soon manifest in devastating ways. In 1964, when Robert was 19 and fresh out of high school, the unthinkable happened. His father was arrested for molesting a 12-year-old girl. The scandal rocked their small community, but before the case could go to trial, before Robert could even begin to process what his father had done, the man committed suicide while awaiting his day in court. The psychological impact on Robert was immediate and profound. In the same year his father killed himself, Robert joined the Marine Corps, perhaps seeking the structure and discipline he had lost. But military life didn't provide the stability he needed. Instead, it revealed something darker developing within him. Robert was dishonorably discharged from the Marines for his involvement in a robbery, his first recorded step into a life of crime. After his discharge, Robert attempted to find his way. He enrolled in college but dropped out. He tried to join law enforcement, drawn perhaps to the authority and control that police work represented, but his dishonorable discharge made him ineligible. He bounced between jobs, stores, supermarkets, warehouses, restaurants, never finding anything that satisfied the growing darkness inside him. By the 1970s, Robert had found work as a long-haul truck driver, a profession that would give him everything he needed to become one of America's most prolific serial killers. The job offered freedom from oversight, constant travel across state lines, and most importantly, access to the most vulnerable members of society: hitchhikers, runaways, sex workers, and women in desperate situations. As Robert crisscrossed the country throughout the 1980s, he developed interests that extended far beyond normal sexual expression. He became deeply involved in the BDSM scene, but his participation went beyond consensual adult activities. His CB radio handle became Whips and Chains, a reference that his fellow truckers thought was just colorful personality, but which actually reflected his growing obsession with control and pain. Robert married 3 times during this period. His third wife later told FBI investigators that he regularly organized orgies in their home and pressured her to perform acts that satisfied his increasingly sadistic fantasies. She claimed he brought men into their house to act as her sex slaves and that he became physically, verbally, and sexually abusive toward her. What she didn't know was that these activities were just practice for what Robert was doing on the road. Sometime in the mid-1970s, Robert began converting the sleeper cab of his truck into something no one could have imagined, a fully functional torture chamber. He installed chains and handcuffs on the ceiling, allowing him to restrain victims in spread eagle positions. He lined the walls with hooks and mounting points for restraints. He kept a stained mattress where victims would sleep, and most horrifically, he maintained what FBI agents would later call a rape kit, a briefcase filled with torture devices including dildos, whips, alligator clips, needles, pins, and even a horse's bridle. The compartment was hidden completely from view unless someone looked directly between the seats. To anyone casually observing his truck, Robert appeared to be just another long-haul driver making a living on America's highways. But inside his cab was a carefully constructed chamber of horrors that could be deployed anywhere in the country. Robert's method was as simple as it was effective. He would cruise truck stops, rest areas, and highway on-ramps looking for women in vulnerable situations. His targets were often hitchhikers, sex workers, known as lot lizards, who frequented truck stops, or women whose cars had broken down. To these desperate people, Robert appeared as a savior, an authoritative ex-military man who seemed trustworthy and fatherly. His victims later described him as charming and disarming. He would offer rides, food, shelter, even money to women who had nowhere else to turn. Many climbed willingly into his cab, grateful for what they believed was genuine help. They had no way of knowing they were entering a nightmare from which many would never escape. Once his victims were inside the truck and had fallen asleep or let their guard down, Robert would handcuff their hands and feet. By the time they woke up, they were already chained in his torture chamber, completely at his mercy. He would keep them for days, weeks, or even months, subjecting them to unimaginable sexual and physical torture before finally killing them and dumping their bodies along remote stretches of highway. The FBI estimates that between 1975 and 1990, Robert Ben Rhodes may have tortured and killed as many as 50 women. His ability to evade capture for so long was partly due to the nature of his profession. He was constantly moving between jurisdictions, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to connect crimes across multiple states. But it was also due to the invisibility of his victims, women society often overlooked or dismissed. His first confirmed murders occurred in November 1989, when he picked up newlyweds Patricia Walsh, 24, and Douglas Ziskowski, 28, who were hitchhiking from Seattle to Georgia, where they planned to preach the Christian gospel. Robert killed Ziskowski almost immediately, shooting him in the head and dumping his body near Interstate 10 in Ozona, Texas. His body was found in January 1990, but wasn't identified until 1992. Patricia Walsh, however, Robert kept alive for over a week. During this time, he tortured and raped her repeatedly in his mobile chamber before finally killing her and dumping her body in Millard County, Utah. Her remains weren't found until October 1990, and it took another 13 years before forensic scientists could identify her body using dental records. For all those years, Patricia Walsh was known only as Jane Doe 1, another nameless victim of highway violence. But Robert's most documented and haunting crime began in February 1990 when he encountered 14-year-old Regina K. Walters and her 18-year-old boyfriend, Ricky Lee Jones, hitchhiking near Pasadena, Texas. Both were runaways looking for a fresh start somewhere else. To them, Robert appeared to be offering exactly what they needed, a ride to a new life. Robert killed Ricky almost immediately, shooting him in the head and dumping his body near Harleton, Texas, where it was found in May 1990. But Regina, he kept alive for several weeks in what prosecutors would later call the most extensively documented case of torture and murder in modern American criminal history. During Regina's captivity, Robert did something that revealed the true depth of his sadism. He took photographs, lots of them. The images, so later discovered during a search of his home, showed Regina at different stages of her captivity. In some photos, her hair was long. In others, it had been cut short. The progression of images showed various stages of bruising and injury, proving that Robert had kept her alive and continued torturing her over an extended period. In one of the most chilling aspects of the case, Robert would call Regina's father from payphones during her captivity. In one call, he told the desperate father that he had cut Regina's hair. These calls weren't demands for ransom or attempts at negotiation. They were pure psychological torture designed to inflict maximum pain on Regina's family while she was still alive and suffering. The final photographs Robert took of Regina were discovered after his arrest, and they remain some of the most disturbing evidence ever collected in a serial killer case. They show a broken, terrified child in the final moments before Robert killed her with a baling wire garrote. These images provided crucial evidence for his conviction, but they also revealed the extent of his sadistic pleasure in documenting his victims' suffering. Robert's reign of terror might have continued indefinitely, if not for a single moment of chance on that April morning in 1990. When Trooper Miller found that truck on the highway shoulder, Robert was in the process of transporting his latest victim, a woman who had survived 2 weeks of torture in his mobile chamber. Her name was Lisa Pennell, and she had met Robert at a coffee shop in Buckeye, Arizona, where he offered her a ride to her destination. Like so many before her, Lisa had fallen asleep in the cab, only to wake up chained and helpless. For 2 weeks, Robert had kept her captive, repeatedly assaulting and torturing her as he drove across multiple states. She had been whipped until her body was covered in welts, had pins inserted into her nipples and genitals, and had been forced to wear a horse's bridle to prevent her from screaming. When Miller discovered her, Lisa was barely alive, but unlike Robert's other victims, she was found in time. Her rescue led to Robert's immediate arrest and the end of a killing spree that had lasted over 15 years. During the search of Robert's truck and home, investigators uncovered a treasure trove of evidence that painted a picture of systematic sadism. Beyond the photographs of Regina Walters, they found detailed modifications to his truck that showed years of planning and refinement. The torture chamber had been carefully designed and perfected over time, with new restraint points and devices added as Robert learned what was most effective for controlling and tormenting his victims. The FBI agent who examined Robert's rape kit called it one of the most refined collections of torture devices he had ever seen, clearly the product of years of experience and experimentation. The briefcase contained not just tools for inflicting pain, but implements specifically designed to maximize psychological terror and physical helplessness. In 1994, Robert Ben Rhodes was convicted of the first-degree murder of Regina K. Walters and sentenced to life in prison without parole, but the legal process was far from over. In 2005, he was extradited to Utah to face charges for the murders of Patricia Walsh and Douglas Ziskowski. However, at the request of the victims' families, who didn't want to endure multiple trials, those charges were dropped in 2006. Finally, in 2012, more than 20 years after the crimes were committed, Robert was extradited to Texas, where he pleaded guilty to the murders of Patricia Walsh and Douglas Ziskowski in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He received a second life sentence, ensuring he would never see freedom again. Today, Robert Ben Rhodes sits in the maximum security Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois, where he will remain until he dies. He is now approaching 80 years old, a frail man bearing little resemblance to the predator who once terrorized America's highways. But the impact of his crimes continues to reverberate through the families of his victims and the communities he devastated. The case of Robert Ben Rhodes illuminates some of the darkest aspects of American society: the vulnerability of women who find themselves alone and desperate, the way interstate commerce can provide cover for predators, and the invisible epidemic of violence that occurs in the margins of our society. His victims were women that many people never bothered to look for: runaways, sex workers, hitchhikers, and others who existed outside traditional social safety nets. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that Robert operated successfully for over 15 years, potentially killing 50 women without detection. His mobile torture chamber rolled across America's highways day after day, year after year, carrying unimaginable suffering through the very transportation networks that connect our communities. The FBI has since established the Highway Serial Killing Initiative, recognizing that the nation's trucking industry provides unique opportunities for serial killers to find victims and evade capture. But for every Robert Ben Rhodes who is caught, investigators wonder how many others might still be out there using America's highways to hunt for their next victim. Robert's story also raises profound questions about the nature of evil and the origins of extreme sadism. Was he created by the trauma of his father's crimes and suicide, or was he simply born with a capacity for cruelty that would have manifested regardless of circumstances? His childhood seemed relatively normal until his father's arrest, but the speed with which Robert descended into criminality after that event suggests that the psychological damage was both immediate and permanent. What we know for certain is that Robert Ben Rhodes represents one of the most methodical and sadistic killers in American history. His mobile torture chamber wasn't the product of sudden violence or momentary rage. It was the result of careful planning, years of refinement, and a deep understanding of how to inflict maximum suffering while avoiding detection. The man who once rolled across America's highways, hunting for victims in his carefully constructed chamber of horrors, now spends his final years in a concrete cell. But the terror he inflicted, the lives he destroyed, and the families he devastated serve as a permanent reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, traveling our roads and blending into our communities until the moment it reveals its true nature. For the families of his victims, there may never be complete closure. Too many questions remain unanswered, too many bodies were never found, and too many years passed before justice was finally served. But perhaps there is some small comfort in knowing that Robert Ben Rhodes will never again have the opportunity to transform another truck cab into a torture chamber, and that his reign of terror on America's highways has finally come to an end. In the heart of California, where granite peaks pierce the skies and ancient sequoias stand sentinel over emerald valleys, there exists a place of breathtaking beauty. Yosemite National Park, a sanctuary of natural wonder that draws millions of visitors each year seeking peace, adventure, and connection with something greater than themselves. But in 1999, this paradise became a hunting ground for something far darker. A man who worked among the tourists, smiled at families, and helped visitors find their way, was secretly orchestrating a nightmare that would shatter the illusion of safety in one of America's most beloved destinations. His name was Cary Stayner, and if you've never heard of him, it's not because his crimes weren't horrific enough to remember. It's because his story was overshadowed by a tragedy that had haunted his family for decades. A tragedy that some believe twisted him into the monster he became, while others argue merely revealed what was always lurking beneath the surface. Cary Anthony Stayner was born on August 13th, 1961, in Merced, California, a modest farming town that styled itself as the gateway to Yosemite. He was the oldest of 5 children born to Kay and Delbert Stayner, and by all accounts, his early years seemed unremarkable. But beneath the surface of suburban normalcy, something was already wrong. At just 3 years old, Cary was diagnosed with trichotillomania, a compulsive disorder that drove him to pull out his own hair. The condition was severe enough that doctors placed him on medication, but the urges never truly went away. Throughout his childhood and into his teenage years, Cary would compulsively tear at his scalp, leaving bald patches that made him a target for bullies. He took to wearing hats constantly, trying to hide the evidence of the torment happening inside his own mind. But the hair pulling was just the beginning. Even before tragedy struck his family, Cary displayed behaviors that would chill anyone who knew what he would become. He exposed himself to his sister's friends during sleepovers, began having violent sexual fantasies, and by age 7, he claimed he was already dreaming about kidnapping and murdering women. These weren't fleeting thoughts or typical childhood curiosity. They were detailed, persistent visions that would grow stronger with each passing year. Then came December 4th, 1972. Cary was 11 years old when his 7-year-old brother Stephen walked to school and never came home. Stephen had been abducted by Kenneth Parnell, a convicted child molester who would hold him captive for the next 7 years, repeatedly sexually abusing him and convincing him that his parents no longer wanted him. The disappearance of Stephen Stainer became a national story. Search parties combed the hills around Merced. Missing person flyers with Stephen's smiling face appeared on telephone poles and store windows across California. Television crews descended on the family home, and through it all, Carrie watched as his parents' world collapsed around their missing son. Kay and Delbert Stainer were consumed by grief and hope in equal measure. They held vigils, cooperated with investigators, and never stopped believing that Stephen would come home. But their surviving children, including Carrie, seemed to fade into the background. The family's emotional energy, their attention, their love, everything became focused on the ghost of the boy who wasn't there. Carrie later claimed that this period made him feel invisible, unwanted, forgotten. He would lie awake at night, listening to his mother cry, watching his father stare out windows as if Stephen might appear at any moment. Some who knew the family said Carrie would go outside and wish on stars, begging for his brother to return. Others remember him expressing guilt, wondering if somehow he should have been with Stephen that day, if he could have protected him. But the truth was more complex and more disturbing. While the family grieved, Carrie's dark fantasies intensified. The attention Stephen received, even in his absence, seemed to fuel something toxic in his older brother's mind. He began acting out sexually, exposing himself not just to his sister's friends, but to other children in the neighborhood. Teachers noted his increasingly inappropriate behavior, but in a family shattered by trauma, these warning signs were overlooked or misunderstood. In February 1980, when Carrie was 18, the impossible happened. Stephen Stainer escaped. Now 14 years old, he had helped another kidnapped boy, 5-year-old Timothy White, break free from their captor. The return of Stephen Stainer was front-page news across America. He was hailed as a hero, the boy who had not only survived 7 years of hell, but had saved another child in the process. The media attention was overwhelming. Stephen's story was turned into books, television movies, and documentaries. The family home was once again surrounded by reporters and cameras. But this time, the attention was celebratory, triumphant. Stephen had come home. For most families, this would have been the end of the nightmare. But for Carrie, it was just the beginning of a new kind of torment. Once again, he found himself in Stephen's shadow, but now it was worse. Stephen wasn't just the missing boy anymore. He was the miracle boy, the survivor, the hero. Every interview, every article, every celebration of Stephen's return was a reminder to Carrie of his own perceived insignificance. Stephen struggled to readjust to normal life after his ordeal, and the family worked to heal from the trauma of his absence. But Carrie's resentment grew like a cancer. He watched Stephen receive counseling, support, and understanding for his suffering, while his own dark thoughts and impulses continued to intensify with no outlet or acknowledgement. In 1989, tragedy struck again. Stephen Stainer, now married with 2 children of his own, was killed in a motorcycle accident at just 24 years old. The family was devastated, but for Carrie, Stephen's death may have provided a twisted sense of relief. Finally, he was free from his brother's shadow, but the damage was already done. Throughout the 1990s, Carrie drifted through various jobs and relationships. He worked as a window installer and later claimed that during this period, he fantasized about driving a truck through his workplace and killing everyone inside. In 1991, overwhelmed by his violent thoughts, he attempted suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning, but survived. In 1995, he was briefly hospitalized after claiming to have had a nervous breakdown. Despite these warning signs, Carey managed to maintain a facade of normalcy. He was described by coworkers and acquaintances as quiet, helpful, and reliable. He could be charming when he wanted to be, particularly around women and children. This ability to present a normal exterior while harboring such dark thoughts made him all the more dangerous. In 1997, Carey found what would become his perfect hunting ground. He was hired as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge, a motel located just outside the Highway 140 entrance to Yosemite National Park. The lodge catered to tourists visiting the park, providing Carey with a constant stream of potential victims, people who were far from home, relaxed and trusting, unaware of the predator living just upstairs from the restaurant. For nearly 2 years, Carey worked at the lodge, fixing leaks, maintaining the grounds, and helping guests with their needs. He was well liked by the staff and trusted by management. Guests often complimented his helpfulness and professionalism. He even developed a relationship with one of the waitresses, a single mother with 2 young daughters who saw him as a gentle, caring man. But behind his helpful exterior, Carey was planning. He later admitted that approximately a year before his first confirmed murders, he had planned to kill his girlfriend and her 2 daughters. He had gone to her house with the intention of slaughtering the family, but when he saw that a male caretaker was present, he lost his nerve and left. The family never knew how close they had come to becoming his first victims. February 15th, 1999, was a day that would forever change the perception of safety in one of America's most cherished natural spaces. 3 women checked into the Cedar Lodge: 42-year-old Carol Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Julie, and Julie's 16-year-old friend Silvina Peloso, an exchange student from Argentina. They had spent the day exploring Yosemite and planned to continue their sightseeing trip the next morning. That evening, as the 3 women settled into their room to watch rented videos and plan the next day's activities, they heard a knock at their door. It was the lodge's handyman, Carey Stainer, claiming there was a leak in their bathroom that needed immediate attention. Trusting and unsuspecting, they let him in. What happened next was a carefully orchestrated nightmare. Stainer emerged from the bathroom with a gun, telling the women that if they cooperated, he wouldn't hurt them. It was a lie. He bound all 3 with duct tape, then systematically murdered Carol and Silvina in the room. Julie, however, was forced to watch her mother and friend die before Stainer took her on a horrific journey. Driving through the darkness with Julie as his captive, Stainer searched for the perfect place to dispose of the bodies. He put Carol and Silvina's corpses in the trunk of their rental car, then drove to a remote vista point near Don Pedro Reservoir. There, he sexually assaulted 15-year-old Julie before cutting her throat and leaving her body near a creek. He then burned the rental car with the other 2 bodies still inside, hoping to destroy any evidence. For weeks, the disappearance of the 3 women baffled investigators. The burned-out car was discovered on March the 18th, containing the charred remains of Carol Sund and Silvina Peloso. Julie's body was found a week later after authorities received an anonymous note sent by Stainer himself revealing its location. A massive investigation was launched involving FBI agents and law enforcement from multiple counties. The fact that the victims had stayed at Cedar Lodge led investigators to interview all of the motel's employees, including Carrie Stainer. But he was calm, cooperative, and helpful during questioning. He even offered to show agents around the property and open rooms for them to search for evidence. His lack of a criminal record and his helpful demeanor convinced investigators that he was just another witness, not a suspect. This was Stainer's greatest strength as a predator, his ability to hide in plain sight. While task forces hunted for the killer, he continued working at the lodge, maintaining his facade of normalcy, even comforting other employees who were shaken by the murders. He was the helpful handyman, the guy who fixed things and made people feel safe. No one suspected that the monster they were hunting was serving them coffee and cleaning their rooms. For months, the investigation stalled. Authorities arrested and interrogated various suspects, including two brothers with criminal records who were wrongly accused of the crimes. Meanwhile, Stainer watched the media coverage with fascination, knowing that he had outsmarted some of the best investigators in the country. But Stainer's bloodlust wasn't satisfied. The power he had felt, the control over life and death, the ability to terrorize an entire region while remaining invisible, it had awakened something in him that demanded to be fed again. On July 21st, 1999, Joey Ruth Armstrong, a 26-year-old naturalist working at the Yosemite Institute, finished her day of teaching children about environmental conservation and returned to her cabin near the park. Armstrong was passionate about nature education, dedicating her life to helping young people develop a love and understanding of the natural world. She had no idea that she was being watched. Stainer had been stalking the area around Armstrong's cabin, waiting for the right opportunity. That evening, he approached her door with his usual story about needing to check for maintenance issues. When Armstrong answered, Stainer forced his way inside with a gun. But Armstrong was not going to be an easy victim. As Stainer attempted to bind her with duct tape and force her into his truck, she fought back with desperate courage. During the struggle, she managed to partially free herself and dove out of the window of the moving vehicle, hitting the ground hard but rolling to her feet and running for her life into the woods. Stainer pursued her through the darkness, and in a clearing among the trees, he caught up to his prey. Even as Armstrong continued to fight, scratching and clawing at her attacker, Stainer overpowered her. In an act of unspeakable brutality, he decapitated her with a knife, leaving her headless body for investigators to find. The discovery of Armstrong's mutilated corpse sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and the public. The killer had struck again, this time within Yosemite itself, and the brutality of the crime suggested an escalation that terrified investigators. But this murder would also be Stainer's downfall. Several witnesses had seen a blue 1972 International Scout parked near Armstrong's cabin on the day of her disappearance. When police traced the vehicle's registration, it led them directly to Carrie Stainer. FBI agents went to the Cedar Lodge to question Stainer, but he was nowhere to be found. His truck was missing, and his supervisors said he had failed to show up for work. An APB was issued for both Stainer and his vehicle, and the manhunt intensified. On July 24th, 1999, police tracked Stainer to the Laguna del Sol nudist resort outside Sacramento, more than 3 hours away from Yosemite. When agents arrived to arrest him, they found him calmly sunbathing, seemingly without a care in the world. He offered no resistance and was taken into custody. The arrest of Cary Stainer sent shockwaves through the community that had known him. Co-workers at the Cedar Lodge couldn't believe that the helpful, quiet handyman was the monster they had been living and working alongside. The woman he had been dating was horrified to learn that the man she had trusted around her young daughters was a serial killer who had actually planned to murder her family. During his interrogation, Stainer's careful facade finally cracked. FBI Special Agent Jeffrey Rennick, who conducted the interview, used Stainer's own psychology against him. Knowing that Stainer craved attention and recognition, Rennick allowed him to talk about his brother Stephen's kidnapping and the impact it had on his life. This created a rapport that eventually led to a full confession. Stainer admitted to all 4 murders in chilling detail, describing how he had planned and executed each killing with cold precision. But perhaps most disturbing were his attempts to negotiate the terms of his confession. He made 3 requests. He wanted child pornography, he wanted his family to receive any reward money, and he wanted to be imprisoned near his home so his family could visit. When told he could only choose one, Stainer chose the pornography over money for his family and the opportunity to see them again. This choice revealed the depth of his sickness and his complete disconnection from normal human bonds and values. During his trial, details of Stainer's crimes were laid bare in all their horrific complexity. The prosecution painted a picture of a methodical predator who had used his position of trust to gain access to victims, then brutalized them with sadistic pleasure. The defense attempted to argue that Stainer's troubled childhood and his brother's kidnapping had driven him to madness, but the calculated nature of his crimes suggested a man who knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. In November 2000, Stainer was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Joy Armstrong. 2 years later, he received 3 death sentences for the murders of Carol Sund, Julie Sund, and Silvina Peloso. He showed no remorse during sentencing, and his victims' families were left to grapple with the senseless loss of their loved ones. Today, Cary Stainer sits on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he has spent more than 2 decades awaiting execution. Now in his 60s, he has become a case study for criminal psychologists trying to understand how childhood trauma, mental illness, and inherent evil intersect to create a killer. But questions remain. Investigators believe Stainer may have killed others, including Patricia Marie Hicks, whose remains were found in Yosemite in the 1980s. Stainer was known to have attended the trial of a cult leader connected to Hicks, and genetic testing confirmed her identity in 2021. There may be other victims, other families who never received closure, other lives cut short by a man who learned to hide his darkness behind a helpful smile. The story of Cary Stainer forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the complexity of human psychology. Was he a monster created by trauma and neglect, or was the capacity for such brutality always within him, simply waiting for the right circumstances to emerge? His victims, Carol Sund, Julie Sund, Silvina Peloso, and Joey Armstrong, were all women with full lives ahead of them. They were mothers, daughters, friends, Teachers, dreamers who trusted the wrong person at the wrong moment and paid with their lives. Their stories deserve to be remembered not just as cautionary tales, but as celebrations of lives cut tragically short. And in the shadow of Yosemite's granite peaks, where millions still come to find peace and natural beauty, their memory serves as a reminder that evil can wear the most ordinary face, can hide behind the most helpful demeanor, and can strike in the places we least expect it. The wilderness may be wild, but the most dangerous predators often walk among us, waiting for their moment to reveal their true nature. In the unforgiving landscape of American true crime, there exists a category of killers who defy easy categorization. These are not the methodical strategists who hunt for fame, nor the calculating predators who seek specific types of victims. These are the chaos agents, the human storms that tear through lives with devastating randomness, leaving behind only questions and grief. Among this dark fraternity stands a figure whose very existence challenges our understanding of evil itself. His name was Tommy Lynn Sells, and if you've never heard of him, it's not because his crimes weren't horrific enough to remember. It's because his story reveals something so fundamentally disturbing about the human capacity for violence that society has chosen, in many ways, to forget. For 21 years, from 1978 to 1999, Sells carved a path of destruction across America that investigators would later call one of the most prolific killing sprees in modern history. He claimed to have murdered over 70 people, though authorities could only definitively link him to 22 deaths. But the numbers, staggering as they are, tell only part of the story. Tommy Lynn Sells was born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California, arriving into a world that seemed determined to destroy him from the very beginning. He was one of twins, born alongside his sister Tammy Jean to a 17-year-old unmarried mother named Nina, who was already drowning in her own instability. The family lived in grinding poverty, moving constantly between relatives and temporary housing, never finding the stability that children desperately need. When Tommy and Tammy were just 18 months old, tragedy struck with devastating precision. Both twins contracted meningitis, a disease that attacks the brain and spinal cord with merciless efficiency. Tammy Jean died within days, her tiny body unable to fight off the infection. Tommy survived, but the illness left invisible scars that would shape the monster he would become. Some medical experts believe that early brain trauma from meningitis can affect emotional regulation, impulse control, and the ability to form meaningful human connections. In Tommy's case, it may have been the first domino to fall in a chain reaction that would eventually claim dozens of lives. With Tammy Jean gone and overwhelmed by grief and responsibility, Nina sent Tommy to live with his aunt. For a brief moment, it seemed the boy might find the love and stability he desperately needed. His aunt genuinely cared for him and even expressed interest in adopting him permanently. But when Nina learned of the adoption plans, jealousy and possessiveness overcame whatever maternal instincts she possessed. She reclaimed Tommy, tearing him away from the only stable home he had ever known and dragging him back into chaos. The pattern was set early. Every time Tommy found even a small measure of security or affection, it was brutally stripped away. This cycle of abandonment and rejection became the defining characteristic of his childhood, teaching him that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford and that pain was the only constant in life. By age 7, Tommy was already drinking alcohol regularly, a detail that speaks to the complete absence of adult supervision in his life. At 8 years old, something even more devastating occurred. Nina, in an act of unfathomable cruelty, allowed a male acquaintance to sexually abuse her son. Whether she actively participated or simply turned a blind eye remains unclear, but the violation shattered whatever innocence Tommy had left. From that moment forward, his understanding of human relationships became irrevocably twisted. At 10, he began experimenting with drugs, seeking escape from a reality that had become unbearable. By 13, his behavior had become so disturbing that even his dysfunctional family couldn't ignore it. He climbed naked into his grandmother's bed while she slept, an incident that finally prompted the family to banish him completely. Nina took her other children and simply left town, abandoning Tommy without a word. He woke up one morning to find himself utterly alone in the world, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. At 14 years old, Tommy Lynn Sells became a nomad, beginning a journey that would take him across every state in America and leave a trail of bodies stretching from coast to coast. He hitchhiked, hopped freight trains, and walked endless miles along highways and back roads. Sometimes he worked brief manual labor jobs or tried his hand at barbering, but these attempts at normalcy never lasted long. The rage and emptiness inside him demanded expression, and conventional life could never contain the darkness that had taken root in his damaged psyche. His first confirmed murder occurred when he was just 16 years old, though the details remain hazy, even in his own recollections. He claimed to have broken into a house and discovered a man sexually abusing a young boy. In a fit of rage, possibly triggered by memories of his own abuse, Tommy beat the man to death. Whether this account is entirely accurate remains unknown, as no corresponding police reports or missing person cases have ever been found. But it established a pattern that would define his killing career: sudden, explosive violence, triggered by seemingly random encounters. In July 1979, Tommy claimed he shot and killed John Cade Sr. after Cade discovered him burglarizing his home. Again, the details are murky, and investigators have been unable to confirm the crime. But by now, Tommy had discovered something terrifying about himself. Killing made him feel powerful in a way nothing else could. The act of taking a life gave him a rush of control and dominance that temporarily filled the vast emptiness inside him. By the early 1980s, his crimes began to escalate in both frequency and brutality. In St. Louis, Missouri, he bludgeoned to death a woman and her 4-year-old daughter with a baseball bat, an act of such savage violence that it defied comprehension. There was no apparent motive, no robbery, no sexual assault, just pure destruction for its own sake. This would become Tommy's signature: sudden, overwhelming violence directed at the most vulnerable members of society. On July 31st, 1983, he struck again in St. Louis, this time killing Colleen Gill and her 4-year-old daughter Tiffany. Both victims were beaten to death with a blunt instrument in their own home. Witnesses reported seeing a man matching Tommy's description fleeing the scene, but police at the time had no way to connect this random drifter to the crime. He had already vanished, moving on to his next hunting ground, like a predator following some invisible map of violence. The pattern that emerged was both simple and terrifying in its randomness. Tommy would arrive in a new area, sometimes by hitchhiking, sometimes by train, occasionally in stolen vehicles. He would scope out potential victims, usually families with children or women living alone. Then, with no warning and no apparent trigger, he would strike with devastating violence before disappearing again into the vast anonymity of America's highways. What made Tommy Lynn Sells particularly frightening was not just the randomness of his attacks, but the complete absence of any conventional motive. He didn't kill for money, though he sometimes stole from his victims. He didn't kill for sexual gratification, though some of his crimes involved sexual assault. He didn't kill for fame or recognition. In fact, he seemed to prefer remaining invisible. He killed because the act of killing was the only thing that made him feel alive, the only moment when the chaos in his head quieted and he felt something approaching peace. In November 1987, Tommy committed what many investigators consider his most heinous crime, the massacre of the Dardeen family in Ina, Illinois. Keith Dardeen had picked up the hitchhiking Tommy and invited him home for dinner, an act of kindness that would cost him and his family their lives. Tommy shot Keith in the head twice, then mutilated his body in ways too graphic to fully describe. He then turned his attention to Keith's pregnant wife, Elaine, beating her with a baseball bat while she held their 3-year-old son, Peter. The attack was so violent that Elaine went into premature labor. Tommy killed the newborn infant, then murdered Peter as well. The crime scene was so brutal that experienced detectives were physically sickened by what they found. The level of violence went far beyond what was necessary to kill. It was an explosion of rage and sadism that seemed to come from some place beyond human understanding. For years, the case remained unsolved, another mystery in the growing list of Tommy's probable victims. Throughout the late 1980s and the early 1990s, reports of similar crimes began to surface across the country. A mother and daughter murdered in their home in Florida, a pregnant woman killed in Missouri, children disappearing from small towns across the Midwest and South. The crimes bore no apparent connection to each other, except for their stunning brutality and apparent randomness. Police departments in different states had no way to communicate effectively about patterns in transient crime, and Tommy slipped through the cracks of a fragmented law enforcement system. In 1992, Tommy's wanderings brought him to Charleston, West Virginia, where he encountered 19-year-old Fabienne Witherspoon. Unlike so many of his other victims, Fabienne survived to tell her story. Tommy had knocked on her apartment door, claiming he needed help. When she opened the door, he forced his way inside and stabbed her 18 times with a kitchen knife. Somehow, through pure determination and a will to live that defied explanation, Fabienne fought back and escaped, running bleeding into the night until she found help. Her survival was a miracle, but it also provided investigators with their first solid description of the killer. Tommy was arrested and convicted of attempted murder, receiving a 5-year prison sentence. While incarcerated, he was diagnosed with a litany of mental health disorders, bipolar disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and hallucinations. But these clinical terms could hardly capture the depth of his psychological damage or predict the violence he would unleash upon his release. Tommy served only 2 years of his sentence before being paroled in 1997. Within months, he was back to his old patterns, drifting across the country and leaving death in his wake. On October 13th, 1997, in Lawrenceville, Illinois, 10-year-old Joel Kirkpatrick was stabbed to death in his bedroom while he slept. His mother, Julie Rhea Harper, was accused and convicted of the murder, sentenced to 65 years in prison for a crime she didn't commit. It would be years before investigators realized that Tommy Lynn Sells was the real killer, and by then, Julie's life had been destroyed by a wrongful conviction. On October 15th, 1997, just 2 days after murdering Joel, Tommy struck again in Springfield, Missouri, abducting and killing 13-year-old Stephanie Mahaney. The timing was no coincidence. Tommy often killed in clusters, as if the act of murder awakened something inside him that demanded to be fed repeatedly. But for all his cunning in evading capture, Tommy's downfall came from the same impulsive violence that had defined his entire criminal career. On New Year's Eve, 1999, he broke into a home in Del Rio, Texas, where 13-year-old Kayleen Harris and 10-year-old Crystal Searles were having a sleepover. Using a knife he found in the kitchen, Tommy crept into the bedroom where the girls slept and slit both their throats with savage efficiency. Kayleen died almost instantly, her life ending before she even fully awakened. But Crystal, despite having her throat cut deeply, managed to survive through a combination of luck and extraordinary courage. She played dead until Tommy left, then somehow found the strength to crawl to a neighbor's house for help, her blood soaking into the carpet as she fought to stay alive. Crystal's survival was Tommy's undoing. Despite her terrible injuries, she was able to provide investigators with a detailed description of her attacker. A police sketch was circulated, and within days, someone recognized the face as belonging to a drifter who had been seen in the area. Tommy Lynn Sells was arrested on January 2nd, 2000, bringing an end to one of the most prolific killing sprees in American history. Faced with overwhelming evidence, and perhaps finally tired of running, Tommy began to confess. But his confessions were a mixture of truth and fantasy, genuine remorse, and calculated manipulation. He admitted to murders across the country, providing details that only the killer could know, but he also claimed responsibility for crimes he couldn't possibly have committed. Investigators realized that Tommy was working the system, trying to trade confessions for better treatment or transfers to different facilities. Separating fact from fiction in Tommy's confessions became a nightmare for law enforcement. He claimed to have killed over 70 people, but investigators could only definitively link him to 22 murders. Given his transient lifestyle and the vast geographic scope of his crimes, it's entirely possible that the true number of victims was somewhere between these figures, meaning that dozens of families may never know what happened to their loved ones. What made Tommy's case particularly frustrating for investigators was his complete lack of remorse. In interviews, he spoke about murder with the casual indifference most people reserve for discussing the weather. He described the act of killing as the only thing that had ever made him feel truly alive, comparing it to a drug that provided an incomparable high. When asked about his victims, he showed no empathy, no recognition that they had been human beings with families who loved them. "I am hatred," he told ABC News in a chilling 2010 interview. "When you look at me, you look at hate. I don't know what love is. Two words I don't like to use is love and sorry. because I'm about hate. This was not the calculated evil of a criminal mastermind or the twisted philosophy of a killer seeking attention. This was something more primal and perhaps more disturbing, a human being so fundamentally broken that he had become incapable of experiencing the emotions that make us human. Tommy had become a force of nature, as destructive and indifferent as a tornado or earthquake. During his time on death row, Tommy continued to be a subject of fascination for researchers studying the criminal mind. Brain scans revealed abnormalities in areas associated with empathy and impulse control, possibly related to his childhood meningitis or the years of severe abuse and neglect. But even with all the scientific analysis and psychological profiling, the essential question remained unanswered: what transforms a damaged child into a monster who can kill without feeling? On April 3rd, 2014, Tommy Lynn Sells was executed by lethal injection at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. He declined to make any final statement, maintaining his silence until the end. As the drugs took effect, witnesses reported that he simply closed his eyes and appeared to go to sleep, showing the same indifference to his own death that he had shown to the deaths of his victims. With Tommy's execution, one of the most prolific killing sprees in American history came to an end, but the questions his life raised continue to haunt criminologists, psychologists, and society as a whole. How many other Tommy Lynn Sells are out there, drifting through America's vast network of highways and backroads? How many disappearances and unsolved murders might be connected to transient killers who slip through the cracks of our fragmented law enforcement system? Perhaps most disturbing of all, Tommy's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of evil itself. His crimes were not the result of some grand plan or twisted ideology. They sprang from a profound emptiness, a complete absence of the human capacity for connection and empathy. He killed not because he hated his victims specifically, but because killing was the only thing that filled the void where his humanity should have been. The victims of Tommy Lynn Sells deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in his horrific tally, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by random violence. Kayleen Harris, who died protecting her friend; Joel Kirkpatrick, murdered in his sleep by a monster who had no reason to be in his room; Stephanie Mahaney, Keith Dardeen and his family, Colin and Tiffany Gill, and all the others whose names may never be known. They were teachers and students, parents and children, people with dreams and fears, and loved ones who still miss them every day. In the end, the story of Tommy Lynn Sells is not just about one man's descent into evil. It's about the fragility of the systems designed to protect the most vulnerable among us, about the long-term consequences of childhood trauma, and about the terrifying randomness that can bring violence into any life at any moment. He reminds us that monsters don't always announce themselves with grand manifestos or elaborate schemes. Sometimes they simply drift into our lives like smoke, leaving only death and unanswered questions in their wake. The highways of America continue to carry countless travelers, most seeking nothing more than a new start or a way home. But among them, hidden in plain sight, may be others like Tommy Lynn Sells, broken souls carrying storms of violence that could erupt without warning. His legacy is not just the lives he took, but the reminder that evil can wear the most ordinary face, travel the most common roads, and strike with the most devastating randomness. In a world that craves understanding and explanation, Tommy Lynn Sells stands as a reminder that some forms of darkness defy easy categorization. He was not a criminal mastermind or a calculating predator, but something perhaps more frightening. A human being so damaged that he became a force of pure destruction, indifferent to the suffering he caused and incapable of the connections that make us human. His story is one of profound tragedy, not just for his victims, but for the child he once was, before the world taught him that violence was the only language he could speak. He looked like everyone's ideal neighbor: clean-cut, polite, reliable. Richard Evanitz had the kind of face you'd trust immediately, the sort of man who'd offer to help you carry groceries or give directions to lost tourists. He was a Navy veteran, a Good Conduct Medal recipient, someone who showed up to work on time and made small talk at the hardware store. But behind that disarming smile lay something else entirely, something that would terrorize families across multiple states for years, hiding in plain sight until one 15-year-old girl's courage brought it all crashing down. What you're about to hear is the story of a predator who perfected the art of deception, a man who could wave to neighbors while driving home with bound victims in his back seat. This isn't just another serial killer story. This is the chilling account of how evil can wear the most ordinary face and how the people we least suspect can harbor the darkest secrets. On July 29th, 1963, Richard Mark Edward Evanitz was born at Providence Hospital in Columbia, South Carolina. From the outside, the Evanitz household appeared typical of 1960s suburban America, but beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. His father, Joseph, was an alcoholic who would disappear into bottle-fueled rages, belittling his family and calling them morons and peons. His mother, Tess, struggled to hold the fractured pieces together while raising 3 children in an environment thick with tension and unpredictability. The family dynamic was one of constant instability. Joseph and Tess separated when Richard was just a baby, reunited, then separated again when he was 12. The final divorce wouldn't come until 1985, but by then, the damage had been carved deep into young Richard's psyche. He grew up watching his father's explosive anger, learning that cruelty was just another language adults spoke when they thought no one was listening. But Richard didn't rage like his father. Instead, he turned inward, becoming quiet, observant, almost invisible. He learned to read the room, to anticipate moods, to blend into the background. These weren't just survival skills. They were the early foundations of something far more sinister. He was learning to watch people, to understand their vulnerabilities, to move through the world without drawing attention to himself. After graduating from Irmo High School in 1980, Richard briefly managed a Jiffy Lube before making a decision that would define much of his adult life. He enlisted in the United States Navy. For 8 years, he served as a sonar technician, listening to the hidden sounds beneath the ocean's surface. It was fitting work for someone who lived his life, detecting what others couldn't see, understanding the unseen currents that moved beneath calm waters. During his Navy service, Richard received a Good Conduct Medal, a recognition reserved for sailors who demonstrated exemplary behavior, reliability, and dedication to duty. To his commanding officers and fellow sailors, he was exactly what the military valued: disciplined, quiet, and dependable. He followed orders, kept his head down, and never caused trouble. But that medal represented something darker than anyone realized. It was proof that Richard had mastered the art of compartmentalization, of living a double life so effectively that even military scrutiny couldn't penetrate his facade. It was during his Navy years that the first cracks in his mask began to show, though they were subtle enough that most people missed them entirely. On January 3rd, 1987, while stationed in Jacksonville, Florida, Richard's darker impulses broke through. He pulled his car alongside 15-year-old Kelly Ballard as she walked her 3-year-old sister down the street. Without warning, he exposed himself and masturbated while watching the terrified teenager try to shield her young sister from the horrific scene. The next day, he was seen following Kelly and her mother through a mall parking lot, his behavior escalating from impulse to stalking. Fortunately, Kelly and her mother had the presence of mind to record his license plate number and report it to police. When Richard's ship returned to port a month later, he was arrested. Faced with the evidence, he entered a plea of no contest and was sentenced to 3 years probation. When questioned by investigators, Richard's explanation was chillingly matter-of-fact. He told police that he had a problem masturbating in front of girls. It wasn't remorse or shame that motivated his confession. It was the calculated admission of someone who understood he'd been caught and needed to minimize the consequences. Even then, he was managing his image, presenting himself as someone with a problem rather than someone who was dangerous. The military handled the incident quietly, and Richard completed his service without further official incidents. In 1988, he was honorably discharged after 8 years of service. To the outside world, he was a decorated veteran who'd served his country with distinction. The reality was that a predator was being released back into civilian society with enhanced skills in discipline, planning, and emotional control. After his military service, Richard settled into what appeared to be a normal civilian life. He found steady work at businesses that sold compressors and grinding equipment, jobs that required technical knowledge and attention to detail. He was reliable, competent, and unremarkable. He married twice, both times to women significantly younger than himself, and seemed to settle into the rhythm of suburban domesticity. But Richard's fascination with control, with dominance, with the power he felt when terrorizing others, hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone underground, waiting for the right opportunity to surface again. His wives later reported that he had specific desires about how they should look and dress. He wanted them to appear younger, more childlike. As they aged and matured, he grew increasingly restless and dissatisfied. His marriages weren't partnerships, they were rehearsals for something darker. By the mid-1990s, Richard had moved to Spotsylvania County, Virginia, where he continued his pattern of appearing to be the perfect neighbor. He was friendly, but not intrusive, helpful, but not overbearing. He had a way of making people feel comfortable around him, of inspiring trust without effort. But beneath this carefully maintained exterior, something was building pressure. September 9th, 1996, was a day that would forever change multiple families and communities. 16-year-old Sophia Silva had returned home from school and was sitting on her front steps doing homework near Loriella Park in Spotsylvania County. She was a bright teenager with dreams of attending cosmetology school, someone with her whole life stretching out ahead of her. But as she sat there in the fading afternoon light, completely absorbed in her schoolwork, a predator was watching. Richard approached Sophia with the same disarming demeanor he'd perfected over years of practice. There were no witnesses to see exactly how he gained her trust or overcame her resistance, but somehow he managed to abduct her without any apparent struggle. Sophia simply vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. For weeks, her family lived in agonizing uncertainty. Search parties combed the area, volunteers distributed flyers, and investigators followed every possible lead. But Sophia remained missing, existing only in the desperate hope of her loved ones and the growing fear that something terrible had happened. A month later, their worst fears were confirmed. Sophia's decomposed body was found floating in Birchwood Creek off State Route 3 in King George County. The discovery devastated her family and sent shockwaves through the community. But for investigators, it raised more questions than it answered. Who would target a teenager doing homework on her own front steps? And why? The case might have remained unsolved indefinitely if Richard hadn't struck again. On May 1st, 1997, he committed what would become his most heinous crime. Sisters Kristen and Kade Lisk, aged 15 and 12, were returning home from school to their house in Spotsylvania County. They were typical sisters, close despite their age difference, looking forward to an afternoon of homework and television before their parents returned from work. But Richard was watching and waiting. Somehow, he managed to abduct both girls from their own front yard in broad daylight. The logistics of overpowering two people simultaneously, especially children who would have screamed and fought, spoke to a level of planning and preparation that was chilling in its implications. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was something Richard had thought through carefully. For 5 days, Kristen and Katie simply disappeared. Their family lived through every parent's worst nightmare, not knowing if their children were alive or dead, hoping for a ransom call that never came, praying for any news that might bring their daughters home. The community rallied around the family, organizing search parties and distributing missing person flyers, but it was all in vain. On May 5th, their bodies were found in the South Anna River. Both girls had been sexually assaulted, and in a detail that would later prove crucial to linking the crimes, both had their pubic areas shaved. The methodical nature of this detail suggested someone who was not only sadistic, but also organized, someone who had specific rituals or preferences that guided his behavior. The discovery of the Lisk sisters' bodies sent the entire region into a state of fear and paranoia. Parents began walking their children to school, families installed new security systems, and communities that had once felt safe now lived under a cloud of suspicion and terror. But for investigators, the similarities between Sophia Silva's murder and the Lisk sisters' case suggested they were dealing with a serial killer, someone who was targeting young girls and would almost certainly strike again. What made these crimes particularly terrifying was their randomness. The victims hadn't been involved in risky behavior or found themselves in dangerous situations. They were simply young girls going about their normal lives in what should have been safe spaces, their own neighborhoods, their own front yards. If someone like Richard could strike there, he could strike anywhere. For years, the cases remained unsolved. Investigators followed thousands of leads, interviewed hundreds of suspects, and analyzed every piece of physical evidence, but they couldn't identify the killer. Richard, meanwhile, continued his normal life, working, marrying, and maintaining his facade of respectability. He attended community events, chatted with neighbors, and gave no outward sign that he was the monster terrorizing the region. But predators like Richard rarely stop on their own. The urges that drove him to kill didn't disappear. They simply lay dormant, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge again. In 1999, Richard moved to Columbia, South Carolina, where he would eventually make the mistake that would bring his reign of terror to an end. June 24th, 2002, started as a typical summer day for 15-year-old Kara Robinson. She was spending time at a friend's house in Columbia, helping to water plants while her friend was inside. It was the kind of mundane, innocent activity that filled countless summer afternoons for teenagers across America. But as Kara stood in the front yard, she caught the attention of someone who had been driving through the neighborhood, hunting. Richard pulled up in his car and approached Kara with a story about selling magazines or conducting some kind of survey. His demeanor was friendly and non-threatening, the same carefully practiced persona he'd used to gain the trust of countless victims over the years. But as they talked, Kara began to sense that something wasn't right. There was something in his eyes, something in the way he kept glancing around, that triggered her instincts. Before she could react, Richard suddenly produced a handgun and pressed it against her neck. In a voice that was calm but absolutely commanding, he ordered her to get into a large plastic container that was positioned in the back seat of his car. The container was a Rubbermaid storage bin, the kind people use to store Christmas decorations or seasonal clothing. But Richard had modified it, turning it into a mobile prison designed specifically for transporting victims. Kara found herself trapped in total darkness, unable to move or see where she was being taken. The psychological impact of this confinement was almost as traumatic as the physical danger. She was completely powerless, totally dependent on the mercy of someone who had already demonstrated he had none. For the duration of the drive, she could only listen to the sounds of traffic and try to prepare herself for whatever was coming next. When the car finally stopped, Richard moved quickly and efficiently. He transferred Kara from the container to his apartment, where the full scope of his planning became apparent. This wasn't a spontaneous crime. Richard had prepared for this moment. His apartment was set up to contain and control a victim with restraints and other tools that suggested he had done this before. Over the course of 18 hours, Richard repeatedly sexually assaulted Kara while keeping her bound to his bed. He also forced her to smoke marijuana, possibly as a way to make her more compliant, or simply as another form of control and degradation. Throughout the ordeal, he spoke to her in a manner that was both terrifying and bizarrely conversational, as if what he was doing was normal, even pleasant. But Richard made a critical error, perhaps because he felt completely secure in his control over the situation, or perhaps because the prolonged assault had exhausted him. He eventually fell asleep while Kara was still restrained. It was the opportunity she had been waiting for, and she seized it with extraordinary courage and determination. Working carefully and quietly, Kara managed to free herself from her restraints. She then did something that would prove crucial to bringing Richard to justice. She observed and memorized details about her surroundings. She noted the layout of the apartment, personal items that might help identify her captor, and anything else that could assist law enforcement. Then, she slipped out of the apartment and ran for help. Kara's escape set in motion a chain of events that would finally bring Richard's crimes to light. She was able to provide investigators with a detailed description of her attacker, his vehicle, and the location where she had been held. For the first time in years of investigation, they had a living witness who could point them toward their suspect. But Richard wasn't finished yet. When he discovered that Kara had escaped, he didn't panic in the way most criminals might. Instead, he made a series of calculated decisions that revealed just how methodical and prepared he had always been. He knew that his time was running out, and he began to take steps to either flee or end the situation on his own terms. On June 27, 2002, Richard called his sister Jennifer and made a confession that was both chilling and revealing. He told her that he had committed more crimes than he could remember and asked her to meet him at an IHOP restaurant in Jacksonville, Florida. The phrasing of his confession was significant. He didn't say he had committed a few crimes or even many crimes. He said he had committed more crimes than he could remember, suggesting a level of serial offending that went far beyond what investigators had discovered. Jennifer, to her credit, didn't agree to meet her brother. Instead, she immediately contacted law enforcement and reported what Richard had told her. Her decision to prioritize public safety over family loyalty was crucial in ensuring that Richard wouldn't have the opportunity to harm anyone else. Later that same day, police tracked Richard to Sarasota, Florida, where they surrounded him on Bayfront Drive. The end came quickly but predictably. When officers urged him to surrender peacefully, Richard refused. As police moved in and released a K-9 unit, Richard pulled out a .25 caliber handgun and shot himself in the head. He was declared dead at 10:52 p.m., taking with him the secrets of how many victims he had truly claimed over the years. After Richard's death, investigators were finally able to connect him definitively to the Silva and Lisk murders through forensic evidence found in his possession. Fibers from the crime scenes matched materials found in his apartment, and other physical evidence confirmed what Kara's testimony had suggested. Richard Evanitz was indeed the monster who had terrorized Virginia families for years. But the case also raised disturbing questions about how many other crimes Richard might have committed during his years of freedom. His confession to Jennifer that he had committed more crimes than he could remember suggested a much larger scope of offending than what had been officially documented. Investigators began looking into cold cases across the multiple states where Richard had lived and traveled during his Navy service and civilian life. One case that drew particular attention was the 1988 murder of 12-year-old Sarah Margaret Cherry in Bowdoin, Maine. Sarah had been abducted while babysitting, then sexually assaulted, stabbed, and strangled. Another man, Dennis DeShane, had been convicted of the crime, but some investigators began to suspect that Richard might have been the actual perpetrator. Richard's naval service had placed him in the area at the time of the murder, and his method of operation matched the crime in several disturbing ways. The possibility that Richard had been killing for far longer than anyone realized was supported by other evidence as well. Investigators found that he had been suspected in a 1994 abduction and a 1995 rape in Spotsylvania, Virginia, suggesting that his crimes in that area had begun earlier than the Silva murder. There were also questions about other missing persons cases and unsolved murders that occurred in areas where Richard had lived or traveled. What made Richard particularly dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize his crimes and maintain his facade of normalcy. Unlike many serial killers who are caught because their behavior becomes increasingly erratic or because they can't maintain their cover stories, Richard seemed to have perfected the art of living a double life. He could commit horrific acts of violence and then return to his normal routine without anyone around him suspecting anything was wrong. His wives later reported that they had no idea about his criminal activities. They described him as a loving husband who enjoyed making people laugh and working with animals. The disconnect between this description and the reality of his crimes illustrates just how effective his deception was. He wasn't an obviously disturbed individual who raised red flags. He was someone who had learned to wear the mask of normalcy so convincingly that even those closest to him never saw through it. The case also highlighted the importance of victim survival in solving serial crimes. If Kara Robinson hadn't escaped, if she hadn't been brave enough to memorize the details of her captivity, if she hadn't been willing to work with investigators to identify her attacker, Richard might have continued killing indefinitely. Her courage not only saved her own life, but potentially saved the lives of future victims and brought justice for those who had already died. Today, Richard Evans is remembered not as the decorated Navy veteran or the helpful neighbor, but as one of the most insidious predators in American criminal history. His case serves as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears the most ordinary face, lives in the most normal neighborhoods, and hides behind the most respectable facades. For the families of Sophia Silva, Kristen Lisk, and Cady Lisk, Richard's death brought an end to their long wait for justice, but it could never restore what they had lost. Their daughters had been taken from them by someone who wore the mask of a good neighbor while harboring the instincts of a predator. And for investigators across multiple states, questions remain about other crimes Richard may have committed, other families who may never know what happened to their loved ones. The story of Richard Evans is ultimately a story about the masks we all wear and the secrets we all keep. But for most of us, those masks hide ordinary human flaws, and those secrets are mundane disappointments. For Richard, they concealed something far more sinister, the capacity for calculated cruelty that allowed him to destroy lives while maintaining the appearance of being just another face in the crowd. He looked like he belonged in the pages of a Norman Rockwell painting. Blue-collar honest, the kind of man who fixed your car with calloused hands and a smile that spoke of simple pleasures and hard work. Haden Clark was the gardener you'd trust around your children, the handyman who'd wave from his rusty pickup truck as he drove through your neighborhood on his way to another odd job. He was invisible in the way that working class men often are, blending seamlessly into the fabric of suburban American life. But beneath that unremarkable exterior lived something that defied every assumption about the nature of evil. What you're about to hear isn't just the story of a killer. It's the chilling account of how a family's darkest secrets can poison multiple generations, how childhood trauma can metastasize into something monstrous, and how evil can wear the most ordinary face while hiding in plain sight for decades. This is the story of Haden Clark, a man whose crimes were just so deeply disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend their scope. And perhaps most terrifying of all, it's the story of how evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and grand gestures. Sometimes it simply knocks on your door and asks if you need your garden tended. On July 31st, 1952, Haden Irving Clark was born into what appeared to be the American dream incarnate. His family resided in Troy, New York, in a picture-perfect colonial house that spoke of prosperity and stability. His father, Haden Clark Sr., was a brilliant chemist with a PhD, a Korean War veteran whose intelligence and drive had lifted the family into the comfortable middle class. His mother, Flavia, carried herself with the pride of someone who could trace her lineage back to the Mayflower, her ancestors having fought as heroes in the Revolutionary War. To their neighbors, the Clarks were everything a family should be. They were active in Boy Scout troops, attended PTA meetings religiously, and participated enthusiastically in church and civic organizations. Haden Sr.'s grandfather had even served as the elected Republican mayor of White Plains, New York. This was a family with deep roots in American tradition, a family that represented the very best of what the country had to offer. But behind the carefully maintained facade of respectability, the Clark household was rotting from within. Both parents were alcoholics, whose drinking transformed them into entirely different people once the sun went down. What began as social drinking quickly escalated into something far more destructive, turning their home into a battlefield where violent arguments erupted with predictable frequency. The children, Bradfield, Haden, Jeffrey, and Allison, learned to navigate their parents' volatile moods with the hypervigilance of soldiers in a war zone. They never knew which version of their parents they would encounter. The respectable community leaders who smiled at church functions, or the drunk, rage-filled strangers who screamed obscenities at each other while their children cowered in their bedrooms. But Haden's experience was different from his siblings in ways that would prove catastrophic. His mother, when drunk, had developed a particularly cruel form of psychological torture specifically designed for her second son. She would dress him in frilly girls' clothing and force him to attend school that way, calling him Kristen, while his father watched with drunken amusement. When his father joined in the abuse, he preferred a different approach, regularly referring to his son as the retard, with the casual cruelty that only alcohol could unleash. The humiliation didn't end at home. At Bucks County Technical High School in Pennsylvania, where the family had moved as part of Haden SRS, endless quest for better employment, Haden became a target for bullies who sensed his vulnerability like sharks detecting blood in the water. They mocked his awkwardness, his social difficulties, his inability to fit in with the other boys his age. Most children in similar circumstances might have withdrawn into themselves, becoming victims of their circumstances. But Haden chose a different path. He began to fight back, not against his human tormentors, but against something smaller and more vulnerable than himself. He started torturing and killing the pets owned by the children who bullied him. These weren't impulsive acts of childhood cruelty. They were calculated, methodical, and executed with a precision that suggested something far more sinister than typical juvenile misbehavior. Haden would carefully select his targets, plan his approach, and then carry out his revenge with a level of detachment that disturbed even those who witnessed the aftermath. The pattern was always the same. A child would humiliate Haden at school, and within days, their beloved pet would disappear or be found dead under mysterious circumstances. No one made the connection initially, but Haden was already learning one of the most important lessons of his young life: that pain could be transferred from the powerful to the powerless, and that the satisfaction of inflicting suffering could temporarily ease his own psychological wounds. As Haden grew older, his family continued to disintegrate around him. His father's job changes became increasingly frequent as his drinking affected his professional performance, forcing the family to relocate repeatedly. Each move meant new schools, new bullies, new opportunities for humiliation. The instability that had always characterized the Clark household intensified, and with it, Haddon's own psychological fragmentation. His sister Allison was the first to recognize the toxicity of their family situation. As a teenager, she simply vanished one day, cutting all ties with her parents and siblings and disappearing into a life none of them would ever know. Years later, when investigators interviewed her about her childhood, she would say with bitter finality, "I never had a family." But even as his family fell apart around him, Haddon seemed to find his calling. After graduating from high school in 1974, he enrolled at the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, New York, where he discovered a talent for cooking that gave him the first sense of accomplishment he had ever experienced. For the first time in his life, he found something he was genuinely good at, something that earned him respect and recognition from his instructors and peers. The knife work came naturally to him. The precise cuts, the methodical preparation, the transformation of raw flesh into something palatable, all of it spoke to something deep within Haddon's psyche that he couldn't yet articulate. His fellow culinary students noticed his particular enthusiasm for butchering and meat preparation, the way his eyes would light up when he worked with blood and bone and sinew. But even his classmates' admiration couldn't completely suppress the darker impulses that had been building within him for years. Some of his co-workers at the restaurants where he found employment began to notice disturbing behaviors that they couldn't quite explain. They would find him in the walk-in coolers after hours, drinking the blood that drained from the meat he had prepared. When confronted, he would laugh it off as a joke, but the intensity in his eyes suggested something far more serious. Between 1974 and 1982, Haddon held 14 different jobs in the food service industry. He worked at prestigious restaurants, luxury hotels, and had even spent time on cruise ships, but his employment never lasted long. His co-workers found him odd, unpredictable, prone to sudden mood swings that could transform him from a helpful colleague into something altogether more threatening. The pattern was always the same. He would arrive at a new job with impressive credentials and genuine culinary skill, work well for a few weeks or months, and then begin to exhibit the disturbing behaviors that would eventually lead to his dismissal. Employers rarely gave specific reasons for letting him go, but the common thread was always the same. Something about Haden Clark made people deeply uncomfortable. In 1982, facing yet another employment termination and running out of options in the civilian world, Haden made a decision that would temporarily provide structure to his increasingly chaotic life. He enlisted in the United States Navy as a cook, hoping that military discipline might help him control the impulses that kept sabotaging his civilian career. For a brief moment, it seemed like the structure and purpose of military life might be exactly what Haden needed. He served competently as a cook aboard various naval vessels, and his culinary skills earned him respect from his fellow sailors. But the military couldn't change who Haddon was at his core, and it wasn't long before his fellow sailors began to notice the same disturbing behaviors that had plagued his civilian employment. His shipmates discovered that Haddon wore women's underwear beneath his uniform, a practice that sparked both mockery and violence from the other sailors. They would beat him regularly, sometimes locking him in meat freezers for hours as punishment for his perceived abnormalities. Rather than suppress his unconventional behaviors, the abuse only seemed to intensify them. The breaking point came when Haddon began to exhibit symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, a mental illness that would plague him for the rest of his life and call into question every confession, every claim, every story he would later tell about his crimes. In 1985, after 3 years of service, he was given an honorable discharge and diagnosed with a mental illness that military psychiatrists deemed incompatible with continued service. He returned to civilian life as a broken man in his early 30s, diagnosed with a serious mental illness, with no stable employment prospects, and with a family that had scattered to the winds. His father had died from cancer shortly after a bitter divorce. His mother had disowned her surviving children, and his siblings had either disappeared or were dealing with their own severe problems. It was during this vulnerable period that Haddon went to live with his older brother Jeffrey in Silver Spring, Maryland. Jeffrey, who had managed to build a stable life despite his traumatic childhood, welcomed his troubled brother into his home with the hope that family support might help Haddon get back on his feet. But the arrangement was doomed from the start. Haddon's mental illness, combined with his increasingly erratic behavior, made him an unwelcome presence in Jeffrey's household. The final straw came when Jeffrey discovered Haddon masturbating in front of his young children, behavior that crossed every possible line of decency and safety. On May 31st, 1986, Jeffrey ordered Haddon to pack his belongings and leave the house immediately. Haddon was in the middle of this humiliating process when 6-year-old Michelle Dorr came to the door looking for Jeffrey's daughter, Elizabeth, with whom she often played. Michelle was the kind of child who lit up every room she entered, bright, trusting, full of the innocent joy that makes childhood magical. She had walked the short distance from her father's house to Jeffrey's, expecting nothing more than an afternoon of play with her friend. Instead, she encountered Haden Clark at the worst possible moment of his life, when years of accumulated rage and sexual dysfunction had finally reached a breaking point. Haddon told Michelle that Elizabeth was upstairs in her bedroom and invited the little girl into the house. But Elizabeth wasn't home, and Haddon had no intention of letting Michelle leave alive. He led her up to an empty bedroom, where he attacked her with a chef's knife, slashing her throat with the same precision he had once used to butcher meat in restaurant kitchens. But the murder was only the beginning of Haddon's depravity. In a frenzy of violence and sexual perversion, he attempted to sexually assault Michelle's corpse, drank some of her blood, and even ate pieces of her flesh. The cannibalistic elements of the crime spoke to a level of psychological breakdown that defied rational explanation. After satisfying his monstrous appetites, Haddon stuffed Michelle's small body into a duffel bag and drove 12 miles to a wooded area where he buried her in a shallow grave. He cleaned the crime scene meticulously, scrubbing away every trace of blood and violence, and then returned to his normal activities as if nothing had happened. The investigation into Michelle's disappearance was immediate and intensive. The entire community rallied around the Dorr family, organizing search parties and distributing missing person flyers throughout the area. But despite extensive efforts by law enforcement and volunteers, no trace of Michelle could be found. Haddon was questioned as part of the routine canvassing of the neighborhood, but his alibi seemed solid. He had been at work during the time frame investigators had established for Michelle's disappearance, and his time card confirmed his presence at his job. With no physical evidence linking him to the crime and no witnesses to contradict his story, Haddon was eliminated as a suspect. The case went cold, becoming one of those heartbreaking mysteries that haunt communities for years. Michelle's father never recovered from the loss, and the uncertainty about what had happened to his daughter consumed him for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Haden Clark faded back into obscurity, becoming homeless and living out of his pickup truck while working occasional odd jobs as a gardener and handyman. For 6 years, Haddon lived in the margins of society, sleeping in his truck and camping in wooded areas around Bethesda, Maryland. To those who encountered him, he seemed like just another down-on-his-luck working man, someone who had fallen through the cracks of the American economy but was still trying to make an honest living. He was particularly good at ingratiating himself with elderly women who needed help with yard work and home maintenance. His knowledge of gardening and his willingness to work for modest wages made him a valuable resource for homeowners who couldn't afford professional landscaping services. One such homeowner was Penny Houtling, a widow who lived in a comfortable house in Bethesda. Haddon had been working for Penny for nearly 2 years, maintaining her garden and performing various handyman tasks around her property. The relationship was professional but warm, with Penny coming to regard Haddon as a reliable and trustworthy helper. The arrangement worked well until October 1992, when Penny's 23-year-old daughter, Laura, came home from college for a visit. Laura Houtling was everything that Haddon had never been: educated, attractive, confident, and blessed with the kind of privileged background that opened doors and created opportunities. Her very presence in the house seemed to diminish Haddon's importance to her mother, creating a rivalry that existed entirely in his diseased imagination. The situation reached a crisis point when Penny accused Haddon of stealing tools from her backyard shed. The accusation, whether justified or not, triggered something catastrophic in Haddon's already fragile psyche. All the years of humiliation, rejection, and failure seemed to crystallize into a single moment of murderous rage directed at the young woman whose presence had disrupted his carefully maintained relationship with her mother. On October 18th, 1992, Haddon entered the Houtling house through the back door while Laura was alone. He found her in her bedroom, where he attacked her with a kitchen knife, stabbing her repeatedly before suffocating her with a pillow. The violence was swift and brutal, but unlike his previous murder, this killing lacked the cannibalistic elements that had characterized Michelle Dorr's death. After the murder, Haden carefully cleaned the crime scene, demonstrating the same methodical approach he had used after killing Michelle 6 years earlier. But this time, he added an element of theatrical deception that revealed a disturbing evolution in his criminal sophistication. Haden wrapped Laura's body in a bedsheet and carried it through a wooded area to a burial site half a mile from the house. But before leaving the scene permanently, he returned to the house and engaged in an elaborate performance designed to make investigators believe that Laura had left the house alive. He dressed himself in a wig and women's clothing, then walked out the front door of the house in broad daylight, waving to neighbors who assumed they were seeing Laura herself. The deception was intended to establish that Laura had been alive after the time of the murder, giving Haden time to perfect his cover story and dispose of any remaining evidence. But despite his careful planning, Haden made a crucial mistake. In his haste to move Laura's body, he left behind a pillowcase that contained his fingerprints. When investigators processed the crime scene, they were able to lift clear prints that would eventually lead them directly to their killer. The investigation moved quickly once police had physical evidence to work with. Haden's fingerprints were already in the system from his previous arrests, and it didn't take long for investigators to identify him as their primary suspect. When they arrested him, Haden initially denied any involvement in Laura's death, but faced with overwhelming physical evidence, he eventually confessed. More importantly, his confession led investigators to Laura's body, which they recovered 8 months after the murder. The discovery confirmed the details of Haden's story and established a clear timeline for the crime. But it also raised disturbing questions about whether this seemingly ordinary handyman might be responsible for other unsolved murders. Those questions became more urgent when investigators realized that Haden had been living just 2 houses away from Michelle Dorr's family at the time of her disappearance 6 years earlier. The geographic connection, combined with Haden's history of violence against children, made him an obvious suspect in the cold case that had haunted the community for so long. When investigators began re-examining the Michelle Dorr case with Haden as their primary suspect, they made a discovery that would finally bring closure to one family while opening up terrifying new possibilities about the scope of Haden's crimes. They tested the wooden floorboards of Jeffrey Clark's former house and found Michelle's blood in an upstairs bedroom, providing the physical evidence that had been missing from the original investigation. Confronted with this evidence, Haden eventually confessed to Michelle's murder as well, providing details about the crime that only the killer could have known. In January 2000, he led investigators to Michelle's remains, finally ending 14 years of uncertainty for her family. Haden was sentenced to 2 consecutive 30-year prison terms for the murders of Michelle Dorr and Laura Hoteling. But even as he began serving his sentence at Eastern Correctional Institution in Westover, Maryland, investigators couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of his criminal history. Their suspicions were confirmed when Haden was placed in a cell with Jack Truitt, a convicted murderer whose long hair and beard had convinced Haden that his cellmate was actually Jesus Christ. Believing that he was confessing to the Son of God, Haden began revealing details about dozens of other murders he claimed to have committed between the mid-1970s and 1992. The confessions were both detailed and disturbing. Haden described killing women across multiple states, often targeting victims who were vulnerable or marginalized. He spoke of cannibalistic acts, sexual violence, and a level of premeditation that suggested far more criminal sophistication than investigators had previously suspected. One of his most significant confessions involved the murder of an unidentified woman in Massachusetts in 1974, a case that had become known as the Lady of the Dunes. For decades, investigators had struggled to identify both the victim and her killer, but Haden's detailed confession seemed to provide answers to both mysteries. However, the credibility of Haden's confessions was complicated by his diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. The same mental illness that had ended his naval career also made it difficult for investigators to determine which of his claims were factual and which were the products of his diseased imagination. This uncertainty was highlighted when DNA evidence eventually identified the Lady of the Dunes as Ruth Marie Terry and her killer as her husband Guy Rockwell Moldavin, completely contradicting Haden's confession. The revelation raised troubling questions about how many of his other confessions might be fabrications created by a mentally ill man seeking attention or notoriety. Nevertheless, investigators took Haden's claims seriously enough to search his grandfather's former property, where they discovered a plastic bucket containing more than 200 pieces of jewelry. Among the items was Laura Hoatling's high school class ring, confirming at least some elements of Haden's story about keeping trophies from his victims. The jewelry collection suggested that Haden's criminal activities might indeed have extended far beyond the two murders for which he had been convicted. Each piece potentially represented another victim, another family left wondering what had happened to their loved one, another crime that might never be officially solved. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Haden's story isn't the scope of his individual crimes. It's the fact that murder seemed to run in his family like a genetic curse. In 1984, just 2 years before Haden killed Michelle Dorr, his older brother Bradfield had committed an equally horrific crime on the other side of the country. Bradfield Clark had invited Patricia Mack, a married co-worker, to his apartment for dinner. When she rejected his advances, he flew into a rage, strangling her to death before dismembering her body with kitchen knives. But like his younger brother, Bradfield's crimes extended beyond simple murder into the realm of cannibalism. He cooked parts of Patricia's breasts on his barbecue grill and ate them before packaging the remaining body parts in plastic bags. Unlike Haden, who would spend years evading capture, Bradfield was overcome with remorse almost immediately after the crime. He attempted suicide, and when that failed, he called police and confessed everything. He was sentenced to 15 years to life and remains in Pleasant Valley State Prison in California to this day. The parallel between the two brothers' crimes was impossible to ignore. Both had committed acts of extreme violence that escalated into cannibalism. Both had used kitchen knives as their primary weapons, and both had demonstrated a level of premeditation that suggested their actions weren't crimes of passion, but calculated acts of predatory violence. Investigators and psychologists who studied the Clark family began to see patterns that extended beyond individual pathology into something resembling a multi-generational transmission of trauma and violence. The alcoholism, abuse, and psychological torment that had characterized Haden and Bradfield's childhood had apparently created the conditions for both brothers to develop into murderers. Even Jeffrey, the brother who had tried to help Haddon, had not escaped the family curse entirely. Though he had never committed murder, he had been convicted of domestic violence, suggesting that the cycle of abuse that had characterized their childhood was continuing into the next generation. The Clark family's story became a case study in how childhood trauma can metastasize across generations, creating patterns of violence and dysfunction that seem almost impossible to break. It raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil, the role of environmental factors in creating killers, and the limits of mental health intervention in preventing tragedy. Today, Haden Clark remains incarcerated at Eastern Correctional Institution, where he continues to serve his two 30-year sentences. At 71 years old, he will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars, but the questions raised by his case continue to haunt investigators and families across multiple states. His story has become the subject of documentaries, true crime books, and academic studies. But perhaps more importantly, it has forced law enforcement agencies to reconsider dozens of unsolved cases from the time period when Haddon was active. Each of his confessions, regardless of their ultimate credibility, represents a potential lead in cases that might otherwise remain cold forever. The families of his confirmed victims have found some measure of closure in knowing what happened to their loved ones, but for many others, the uncertainty continues. The 200 pieces of jewelry found on his grandfather's property suggest that there may be dozens of families who will never know whether their missing loved ones fell victim to Haden Clark's predatory violence. What makes Haddon's story particularly chilling isn't just the scope of his crimes or the depravity of his actions. It's the way he managed to hide in plain sight for so many years. He wasn't a reclusive loner or an obviously disturbed individual who raised immediate red flags. He was a working man who fixed things and tended gardens, someone who could inspire trust in elderly women and affection in small children. His ability to present himself as harmless, even helpful, allowed him to gain access to victims who never saw the danger until it was too late. He understood instinctively how to exploit the basic human tendency to trust those who appear non-threatening, and he used that understanding to devastating effect. The case also highlights the limitations of the criminal justice system when dealing with mentally ill offenders who are capable of extreme violence. Haddon's diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia raises complex questions about culpability, treatment, and public safety that don't have easy answers. His confessions to dozens of additional murders illustrate the challenge investigators face when trying to separate fact from delusion in the statements of mentally ill suspects. How do you determine which claims are credible when they come from someone whose grasp on reality is fundamentally compromised? The Haden Clark case remains a perfect storm of family dysfunction, mental illness, and predatory violence that created one of the most enigmatic figures in the annals of American crime. His story serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it simply shows up at your door with gardening tools and a friendly smile, offering to help with the yard work while concealing appetites that defy human comprehension. Sometimes the monster next door really is a monster, hiding in plain sight until the moment when their carefully maintained mask finally slips away to reveal the horror underneath. For the families whose loved ones fell victim to Haden Clark's violence, his capture and conviction provided some measure of justice, but it could never restore what was lost or ease the pain of their absence. And for investigators who continue to grapple with his claims about additional victims, his case remains an open wound, a reminder of how much we still don't know about the man who spent decades moving through American communities like a cancer, leaving death and devastation in his wake. The story of Haden Clark is ultimately a story about the masks we all wear and the secrets we all keep. But while most of us hide ordinary human flaws behind our public personas, Haddon concealed something far more sinister. He proved that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear most harmless, and that evil can wear the face of the helpful neighbor who offers to fix your fence and water your garden. In the end, perhaps that's the most terrifying lesson of all, that monsters don't always look like monsters, and that the person you least suspect might be the one you should fear most. In the golden age of Los Angeles, when freeways stretched like concrete arteries across the sprawling basin, connecting dreams to destinations, there was a man who used those very roads as graveyards. He walked among families, smiled at neighbors, operated the massive machines that built the highways millions would travel. But beneath that ordinary exterior lurked something unspeakable, something that would transform him into one of California's most terrifying predators. Have you ever wondered how someone can live a double life so completely that even those closest to them never suspect? How a man can spend his days building the infrastructure of a growing city while spending his nights destroying the most innocent lives within it? This is the story of Mack Ray Edwards, a killer whose crimes were literally buried beneath the roads we drive on every day. What makes this case so chilling isn't just the horrific nature of his crimes, but the calculated way he used his position, his tools, and his knowledge to conceal his victims forever. For 17 years, he operated in plain sight, and when he finally confessed, the truth was so devastating that authorities still haven't found all of his victims. In this vast city of angels, where children played in suburban neighborhoods and families trusted their neighbors, a monster was hiding in the most ordinary of places, and the roads that promised to take people toward their futures were concealing the broken bodies of those who would never grow up to have one. Mack Ray Edwards was born on October 17, 1918, in the rural landscape of Montgomery County, Arkansas. His early life remained shrouded in mystery, with little documentation of what shaped the boy who would become a monster. What we do know is that he grew up during the Great Depression, in a time and place where hardship was common and children were expected to endure whatever circumstances life handed them. In 1941, at the age of 23, Edwards made a decision that would change the trajectory of countless lives. He left Arkansas behind and moved west to Los Angeles County, drawn, like so many others, by the promise of opportunity in California's booming economy. The timing was perfect for a man with his skills. America was on the brink of entering World War II, and California was rapidly expanding its infrastructure to support the war effort. The year after his arrival in Los Angeles, Edwards joined the United States Army Corps of Engineers. It was here that he received a training in the operation of heavy equipment, skills that would serve him well in his civilian career and, tragically, in his crimes. He served as a combat engineer, working with the massive machines that could move Earth, build bridges, and reshape landscapes. When he returned from the war, he brought with him knowledge that would make him invaluable to California's Department of Transportation and deadly to his future victims. In 1946, Edwards married Mary Howell, and for all outward appearances, he began building a normal, respectable life. The couple would later adopt 2 children, creating the picture-perfect American family of the post-war era. Edwards found steady work as a heavy equipment operator, contracted by Caltrans and other agencies to help build the freeway system that would define Los Angeles for generations to come. Between 1950 and 1957, the Edwards family lived in various Los Angeles County cities: Pico Rivera, El Monte, and Azusa. Edwards was known in these communities as a quiet, dependable man who kept horses and allowed neighborhood children to ride them. It was a detail that would later take on sinister significance, as investigators realized how he had used this kindness to gain the trust of local families and their children. But behind this facade of suburban normalcy, something dark was stirring. By 1953, Edwards had begun acting on urges that had been building inside him for years. His first known victim was 8-year-old Stella Darlene Nolan, who disappeared on June 20th, 1953, while at a refreshment stand at a flea market in Norwalk. The crime Edwards committed against Stella reveals the calculated cruelty that would characterize all of his murders. He kidnapped her, took her to his home in Azusa, and sexually assaulted her. But his depravity didn't end there. Edwards then drove the terrified child to the Angeles National Forest, where he manually strangled her and threw her small body over a bridge. What happened next demonstrates the cold-blooded nature of Edwards's psychology. The following day, he returned to the crime scene, perhaps to ensure she was dead or to relive his crime. To his surprise, he found Stella still alive, having crawled approximately 100 yards from where he had left her. She was sitting up but unable to move or speak, probably paralyzed from her injuries. Rather than feeling any remorse or offering help, Edwards pulled out his pocket knife and stabbed the helpless child to death. For 17 years, Stella's fate remained a mystery to everyone except her killer. Edwards buried her body 8 feet under an embankment that would eventually become part of the Santa Ana Freeway. Every day, thousands of commuters drove over her grave, never knowing that a child's remains lay beneath the concrete and asphalt. 3 years later, in 1956, Edwards struck again. This time, his victims were 2 children who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Donald Lee Baker, 15, and Brenda Jo Howell, 11, disappeared together on August 6, 1956, from Azusa. Like Stella before them, they simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind devastated families and no clues for investigators to follow. Edwards had perfected his method by this point. He would approach children with offers of help, work, or rides, gaining their trust through his friendly demeanor and apparent respectability. Once he had them isolated, he would assault and murder them, then use his knowledge of construction sites and heavy equipment to dispose of their bodies in places where they would never be found. After 1956, there was a 12-year gap in Edwards' known murders, a period that has puzzled investigators and criminal psychologists. Some believe he may have committed additional crimes during this time that were never connected to him. Others theorize that he may have temporarily found ways to control his urges, perhaps through the responsibilities of his growing family or the demands of his work. Whatever the reason for the hiatus, by 1968, Edwards' compulsions had returned with a vengeance. On November 26, 1968, 16-year-old Gary Roche was found shot to death in his Sylmar home. Edwards later confessed that he had broken into the house seeking to kidnap Gary's 13-year-old sister, who fortunately was not at home. When Edwards encountered Gary instead, he shot the teenager to prevent him from identifying him later. Just 3 weeks later, Edwards claimed another victim. 15-year-old Roger Dale Madison disappeared on December 16, 1968, from his home in Sylmar. What made this crime particularly heinous was that Edwards wasn't a stranger to the boy. He had a relationship with the Madison family and had even shared meals in their home. Roger trusted Edwards, which made it easy for the predator to lure him to a secluded orange grove, where he stabbed the teenager multiple times before burying his body with a bulldozer under what would become the Ventura Freeway near Thousand Oaks. Edwards's final confirmed victim was 13-year-old Donald Allen Todd, who disappeared from his Pacoima home on May 16, 1969. Like his other victims, Donald lived in Edwards' neighborhood and may have known his killer. Edwards sexually assaulted the boy before shooting him to death and disposing of his body. But Edwards' killing spree might have continued indefinitely if not for a crime that went wrong in 1970. On March 5th of that year, Edwards and a 15-year-old male accomplice broke into the home of the Cohen family in Sylmar. The parents were away, leaving 3 daughters alone: Valerie, 12, Cindy, 13, and John, 14. The girls were former neighbors of Edwards, which is how he knew the family's schedule and layout of the house. Edwards and his accomplice kidnapped all 3 girls, forcing them to write notes claiming they were running away from home. They then drove the terrified children to the remote Bouquet Canyon in Angeles National Forest, where Edwards undoubtedly planned to assault and murder them as he had done with his previous victims. But something went wrong. 2 of the girls managed to escape, running through the forest until they found help. Suddenly, Edwards found himself in an impossible situation. He had living witnesses who could identify him, and authorities would soon be looking for the 3rd girl. Faced with the certainty of capture, Edwards made a decision that shocked everyone involved in the case. On March 6, 1970, Edwards walked into a Los Angeles police station, handed the surprised duty officer a loaded revolver, and announced, "I have a guilt complex." He then directed police to where they could find the 3rd Cohen girl, who was recovered safely from the forest. But Edwards wasn't finished confessing. In what would become one of the most shocking revelations in Los Angeles criminal history, he began detailing a 17-year murder spree that had claimed the lives of at least 6 children. He told investigators about Stella Nolan, Donald Baker, Brenda Howell, Gary Roche, Roger Madison, and Donald Todd, providing details that only the killer could have known. Edwards led police to the burial sites of 3 of his victims, whose remains were finally recovered and returned to their families for proper burial. The discovery of these bodies confirmed the horrific truth of Edwards' confessions and provided closure for families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their children. During his interrogation, Edwards claimed that all of his crimes were motivated by sexual desire. He showed no remorse for his actions, describing the murders in cold clinical terms. When asked why he had finally turned himself in, Edwards gave an explanation that investigators found unconvincing. "I have a guilt complex. I couldn't eat and I couldn't sleep, and it was beginning to affect my work. You know, I'm a heavy equipment operator. That long grater I'm using now costs a lot of money, $200,000. I might wreck it or turn it over and hurt someone." Authorities believed the real reason for his confession was fear. The escape of the Cohen sisters had left him with no choice but to surrender, and his supposed guilt was merely an attempt to gain sympathy or control the narrative of his capture. As investigators delved deeper into Edwards' background, they began to understand the full scope of his crimes. His position as a heavy equipment operator had given him the perfect cover for his murders. He knew where construction was taking place, which sites would be developed, and how to use machinery to bury bodies in locations where they would be covered by tons of concrete and remain hidden forever. The body of Stella Nolan was found exactly where Edwards said it would be, 8 feet under a Santa Ana freeway embankment in Downey. The precision of his directions, combined with his intimate knowledge of freeway construction, confirmed investigators' worst fears about how many other victims might be buried beneath Los Angeles's roadways. During his time in jail awaiting trial, Edwards made conflicting statements about the total number of his victims. He told a guard and fellow inmates that he had killed between 18 and 22 children, but when questioned in court, he reversed himself, insisting 6 is all there is, just 6. The trial of Mack Ray Edwards was a media sensation and a source of profound anguish for the victims' families. Deputy District Attorney David Kenner made an impassioned argument for the death penalty, telling the jury, if ever there was a case that cried out for the imposition of the death penalty, this is the case. This defendant has forfeited whatever right a person has to live in this society. Remarkably, Edwards agreed with the prosecutor. He actually requested the death penalty, telling the court that he wanted to pay the ultimate price for his crimes. "My attorney got a bit mixed up and pleaded for my life," Edwards said. "I want the chair. That's what I've always wanted. I told them that when I went into the police station, but they didn't say that in court. This was sadistic to bring these parents and other witnesses down here and put them through this trial." Edwards was found guilty and sentenced to death in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. But the appeals process in California was lengthy, and Edwards grew impatient, waiting for his execution. Prison records show that he made several attempts to take his own life, finally succeeding on October 30th, 1971, when he hanged himself with a television cord in his cell. With Edwards' death, any hope of finding his remaining victims died with him. To this day, the remains of Donald Baker, Brenda Howell, and Roger Madison have never been recovered, despite extensive searches by law enforcement agencies. In 2008, authorities conducted a massive excavation near the Ventura Freeway, using cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar in an attempt to locate Roger Madison's remains. The search was unsuccessful, and his body remains somewhere beneath the concrete and steel of Los Angeles's freeway system. Edwards is also suspected in numerous other child disappearances throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Investigators have connected him to the potential murders of Bruce Howard Creeman, Karen Lynn Tompkins, Dorothy Gale Brown, Thomas Eldon Bowman, and Ramona Price, among others. The pattern was always the same: children who disappeared without a trace from communities where Edwards was known to have worked or lived. What makes the case of Mack Ray Edwards particularly disturbing is not just the number of victims or the brutality of his crimes, but the way he was able to hide in plain sight for so many years. He was the neighbor who let children ride his horses, the co-worker who showed up reliably for every shift, the family man who attended community events with his wife and adopted children. Edwards represented every parent's worst nightmare: the predator who gains access to children through kindness and familiarity, who uses his position in the community to identify and isolate victims. His crimes demonstrated how a killer could operate for decades without detection, particularly when he had the means and knowledge to dispose of evidence so thoroughly that it would never be found. The psychological profile that emerges from Edwards' case is that of a highly organized and methodical predator. Unlike many serial killers who act impulsively or leave evidence behind, Edwards planned his crimes carefully, used his professional skills to conceal them permanently, and maintained a convincing facade of normalcy that fooled everyone around him. Perhaps most chilling of all is the realization that Edwards's victims weren't just buried beneath the freeways. They became part of the foundation of modern Los Angeles. Every day, millions of people drive over roads that may contain the remains of children who never got the chance to grow up, to have families of their own, or to experience the life that was stolen from them by a monster who lived among them. The legacy of Mack Ray Edwards serves as a reminder that evil can wear the most ordinary faces, and that the systems we build to connect us, our roads, our communities, our trust in neighbors, can be perverted by those who understand how to exploit them. His case changed how law enforcement investigates missing children cases and highlighted the importance of coordinating investigations across jurisdictions and time periods. Today, the freeways of Los Angeles carry millions of commuters to their destinations, unaware that beneath them lie the secrets of one of California's most prolific child killers. The concrete and asphalt that Edwards helped pour have become monuments to his victims, permanent reminders of lives cut short and families destroyed by one man's uncontrollable urges and calculated cruelty. In the end, Mack Ray Edwards took his own life rather than face the consequences of his actions. But his victims remain forever young, forever lost beneath the roads that promised to take us home, but for them became the final destination on a journey that should have lasted a lifetime.